to Chapter 12. We're talking now about the prison experience and prisoner reentry following prison. So any institution, whether it's a school, a bank, a police department, has an organizational culture. And in that culture, we have a set of values. And this helps people in the organization understand what actions are acceptable and what actions are unacceptable. According to a theory put forth by the influential sociologist Erving Goffman, prison cultures are unique because prisons are total institutions that encompass every aspect of an inmate's life. A total institution is an institution, such as a prison, that provides all of the necessities for existence to those who live within its boundaries. Inmates develop their own argot, or way of speaking, and they also have their own way of expressing themselves, or we'll see that technically through body art. They create their own economy, which with the absence of currency is based on a barter of valued commodities such as food, contraband, and yes, sexual favors. They establish methods of determining power, many of which involve violence. So isolated and heavily regulated prisoners create this social existence that is out of both necessity and design, which is separate from the outside world. So upon arriving at prison, each convict attends an orientation session, receives a residence handbook, and that handbook provides information such as meal and official count times, disciplinary regulations, visitation guidelines. And as first described by Donald Clemmer in his 1940 classic work, The Prison Community, the process of prisonization, or adaptation to the prison culture, advances as the inmate gradually understands what constitutes acceptable behavior in the institution. So, for definition, prisonization is the socialization process through which a new inmate learns the accepted norms and values of the prison culture. Now, sociologist John Irwin has identified several patterns of inmate behavior, and each one was driven by the inmate's personality and values. So, professional criminals adapt to prison by doing time. And some convicts, mostly state-raised youth or those frequently incarcerated in juvenile detention centers, are more comfortable inside a prison than they are on the outside. Other inmates take advantage of prison resources such as libraries or drug treatment programs by gleaning or working to improve themselves to prepare for a better society, return to society. And then, of course, there are disorganized criminals, and these are the ones that exist on the fringes of prison society. So who is in prison? The culture of any prison is highly influenced by its inmates. Their values, beliefs, and experiences will be reflected in the social order that exists behind bars. In the past several decades have seen incarceration rates of women and minority groups rise sharply. A prisoner today is much more likely to have been incarcerated on a drug charge or immigration violation than was the case in the 1980s. Today's inmate is also more likely to behave violently behind bars. And though the majority of inmates are still under 34 years old, the number of state and federal prisoners over the age of 40 has increased dramatically since the mid-1990s. And what that means then is that we have an ailing inmate population. About half of those incarcerated report having chronic medical conditions, such as cancer, high blood pressure, diabetes, asthma. And in the federal prison system, the annual cost of housing an inmate who has health problems, many of whom are over 55 years of age, is more than twice the cost of housing a prisoner in general pop. During the 50s and 60s, nearly 600,000 mental patients lived in public hospitals, often against their will. And then there was this series of scandals that happened that looked at poor medical services and horrendous living conditions in those hospitals. So that led to a closure and elimination of those state-run mental health facilities. So, according to the federal government, half of state prison inmates and 60% of jail inmates have experienced some sort of mental health problems. And so that is another concern. So let's talk about prison programs and rehabilitation. So rehabilitation is one of the basic theoretical justifications for punishment. So prison programs, which include any organized activities designed to foster rehabilitation, benefit inmates. And on a basic level, these programs get prisoners out of their cells and alleviate the boredom that marks prison and jail life. And these programs help inmates improve their health and their skills and really gives them a better chance of reintegration into society after release. So we'll just roll through some of these programs. So substance abuse treatment, of course, is very important because we know that the statistics say that 1.5 million prison and jail inmates in the United States meet the medical criteria for substance abuse or addiction counseling or programs. Of course, vocational educational programs, wanting applicants or inmates coming out of prison to basically have a clean slate and be able to start all over in new employment without the fact that being in prison before may weigh them down. So by giving them some vocational or educational skills to be able to return to society with, we're hoping for that to be successful. So what is really the violence that exists in prison, and is it really that bad? Correctional officers use the threat of violence, at times actual violence, to control the inmate population. Sometimes the inmates will strike back. And according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, because of inmate assaults, correctional officers have one of the most dangerous jobs in the United States. So among the prisoners, violence is used to establish power and dominance. So some of the reasons for violence in the prison culture we know can be exactly what we're seeing on the slides here. It can provide a deterrent against being victimized. So standing up, keeping your own, setting the grounds for, not being victimized is a huge piece of it. Definitely enhances your self-image in this type of environment if you are known as a violent individual who gets what they want. It also provides sexual relief. So if we have violence, rape, cases like that. It also serves as a means of acquiring material goods through extortion or robbery. The deprivation model can be used to explain the high level of prison violence. And what this model does is it's a theory that inmate aggression is the result of the frustration inmates feel because they're deprived of freedom, consumer goods, sex, and other staples of life outside the institution. Researchers have researched and addressed this randomness of prison violence by turning to the concept of relative deprivation. And what this refers to is the theory that inmate aggression is caused when freedoms and services that the inmate has come to accept as normal are decreased or eliminated. And riots are defined as situations in which a number of prisoners are beyond institutional control for a significant amount of time. And they really are rare. These incidents are marked by extreme levels of inmate-on-inmate violence and can often be attributed, at least in part, to poor living conditions. So prison rape, like rape in general, is considered primarily an act of violence rather than just about the sex. Abused inmates suffer from rape trauma and a host of other psychological ailments, including suicidal tendencies. The problem is often that many prisons don't offer sufficient medical treatment for these victims, nor does the prison staff really take measures to protect these obvious targets of rape. So race is a huge thing in prison, you guys. It really plays a major role in prison life, and prison violence is often an outlet for racial tension. So as prison populations have changed over the past decades, with African Americans and Latinos being the majority in many of our penal institutions, issues of race and ethnicity have become increasingly important to prison administrators and researchers. As early as the 1950s, researchers were noticing different group structures in inmate life. Today's prisons are divided into hostile groups, with race determining nearly every aspect of the inmate's life. In many instances, racial and ethnic identification is the primary focus of the prison gang. A study that was released in 2011 by Alan Drury and Matt DeLisi of Iowa State University found that gang members were more likely to be involved in prison misconduct than inmates who had been convicted of murder. And the most recent research that's been done by the National Gang Crime Research Center places the proportion of gang members in state prisons and local jails at 30% of male inmates and 9% of female inmates. In that same survey, 87% of corrections officials answered yes to the question, do you believe that some inmates may have voluntarily joined or may have been recruited into a gang while incarcerated? So we call this STG, security threat groups, and this is known as an identifiable group with 3 or more individuals and a leadership structure that poses a threat to the safety of others within the jail. About 2/3 of all prisons have correctional officers who act as the actual STG coordinator. And that official is responsible for all classification of individuals who are likely to be involved in an STG. They're looking at the activities, they're really acting as an investigator. So how do correctional officers maintain discipline? Without them, this would be a place of anarchy. But in the highly regulated, oppressive environment of the prison, correctional officers must use the threat of violence, if not actual violence, to instill discipline and keep order. Thus, the relationship between prison staff and inmates is marked by mutual distrust. Correctional officers and inmates have different concepts of the ideal structure of the prison society, for sure. So the custodial staff at most prisons is organized according to 4 general ranks. We have the captain, the lieutenant, the sergeant, and the officer. And then, of course, we have the CO, which is the correctional officers. And there can be a whole host and range of different areas for COs. Block officers, work detail supervisors, shop and school officers, yard officers. I mean, it goes on and on. And then, of course, administrative building assignments. These are officers who hold positions that provide security at prison gates or oversee visitation or those things. Now, discipline is definitely got 3 general goals. You want to be sure that it ensures a safe and orderly living environment, and to instill respect for authority of correctional officers and administrators, and to teach values. Strict disciplinary measures imposed on prisoners can come as something of a shock and can provoke often really defensive reactions. So one of the first items that an inmate receives on entering a correctional facility is a manual that details the rules of the prisons or the jails, And the United States Supreme Court has ruled that inmates must give a fair hearing before being disciplined. The court denied inmates the right to confront adverse witnesses or consult a lawyer for those hearings. So solitary confinement really will come when it's a very serious crime. And with solitary confinement, you could have a loss of your privileges, such as visits from your family members. There can also be risks with solitary being more of a preventative measure for maybe someone that is getting out of the gangs. So it can be used for different things. Generally, courts have been unwilling to put too many restrictions on the use of force by COs. So correctional officers are given great leeway to use their experience to determine where force is warranted. So in Whitley v. Albers, 1986, the Supreme Court held that the use of force by prison officials violates an inmate's Eighth Amendment protections only if the force amounts to the unnecessary and wanton infliction of pain. Courts have found that the legitimate security interests of a prison or jail justify the use of force when the correctional officer is using one of these 5 steps. So we want to make sure that prisoners' rights are protected. And the general attitude of the law towards inmates is summed up by the 13th Amendment. For most of the nation's history, courts have followed the spirit of this amendment by following the hands-off doctrine of prisoner law. This is an unwritten doctrine, but it assumes that the care of inmates should be left to prison officials and that it is not the place of judges to intervene in the penal administrative matters. So this brings us about to the deliberate indifference standard. And as for those constitutional rights that inmates do retain, in 1976 the Supreme Court established the deliberate indifference standard. And in this case, in this question, Estelle v. Gamble, an inmate had claimed to be the victim of medical malpractice. And in Wilson v. Scheider in 1991, for example, inmate Pearlie L. Wilson filed a lawsuit alleging that certain conditions of his confinement, including overcrowding, excessive noise, inadequate heating, cooling, and ventilation, and unsanitary bathroom and dining facilities were cruel and unusual. But in the Wilson decision, the Supreme Court created the identifiable human needs standard for determining Eighth Amendment violations. And because of this decision, prisoners do have a well-established right to adequate medical care. And adequate has been interpreted to mean a level of care comparable to what the inmate would receive if he or she were not behind bars. So, female prisons are different. The first female prison opened in 1839 on the grounds of New York's Sing Sing Institution. The focus was really on rehabilitation. Prisoners were prepared for a return to society. They took classes on reading and knitting and sewing. But now there's quite a difference in women's institutions. They're really, literally men's institutions, only they pull out the urinals. So that's the biggest difference. As far as characteristics of female inmates, let's look at this list here. Male inmates outnumber female inmates for sure. There are only about 100 women's correctional facilities in the United States. Female inmates are typically low income and undereducated, have a history of unemployment. Female offenders are much less likely than male offenders to have committed a violent offense. Most are incarcerated for nonviolent drug or property crimes. Most are incarcerated for these things because the majority of female inmates are usually under the age of 40, and the population is disproportionately African American. And the single factor that most struggles female prisoners from their male counterparts is a history of physical or sexual abuse. I think we'll stop here and come back and have the second part.